Hello and welcome. My name is Father William Maestri, and this is Overfed and Undernourished. In the following videos, we're going to have two. We're going to address a very important and at the same time sensitive issue facing us as a society and also as individuals. It is the question of pornography. In this first video, what we want to do is lay out the landscape, sort of describe the problem, if you will, or the challenge of the porn industry and the effects that porn has had on the individual as well as society and the family. In the United States government, we have an office, EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency. And that office was established to make sure that our water and air are clean, that our environment is taken care of, that we take care of litter, and all of those kinds of things to make sure that the earth is taken care of and that we inhabit a beautiful place in which to live and to flourish, to raise families, and so on. We do not have a department within the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, that deals with the health and the well-being of our nation's soul, as well as that of the individual. And I would like to suggest to you that pornography is a pollutant. It pollutes. It pollutes our mind. It pollutes the very structure of our brain. Studies are more and more indicating. And it also infects our families. It affects the relationships within the family, and it has a very, very adverse effect on young people, especially young females. And so pornography is a difficult subject because often it's hard to get our hand around just what is pornography. Several decades ago, Associate Justice of the United States Supreme Court, Potter Stewart, he and the brethren on the court, they were faced with a pornography case. And Justice Stewart wrote, "Pornography. I don't know how to define it, but I know it when I see it." Now we can kind of snicker at that and say, well, that's kind of a flippant way to handle the issue. Not really. I think there's a lot of wisdom in that. I may not be able to define it, but I know it when I see it. What I think Justice Stewart was getting at is that there are certain things that we see and experience that do not lend themselves to a kind of Webster's dictionary, a nice, neat, word-for-word explanation of what we're talking about. But there is a visceral reaction. There's a kind of repulsion. There's a kind of drawing back when we see it. And I think what Justice Stewart was saying is that while I can't necessarily put it in specific words, when I see it, I know what pornography is. And it's very important to understand the root meaning of the word pornography. The word pornography in its root is associated with the word violence. Pornography is violence. Now, it's not the kind of violence you may ordinarily think of. It's not with baseball bats and guns and knives. It's not with people with broken arms and black eyes. It's the kind of violence that takes place when this happens. We take one aspect of the human person, whatever that aspect is, and we hold that up as the only significant, worthwhile aspect of that person. That's their only value. And so in pornography, we hold up the sexual, the titillating, the erotic. All of the other qualities of that person are simply discarded. They go invisible. They're not important. What is important is simply the sexual dimension of that person. For example, we may have somebody who is very, very gifted as as a pianist or some other kind of artist, and that's all we value that person for, well, that's doing violence to the complexity of that person. In other words, in pornography, all forms of pornography, but we're talking explicitly about sexual pornography, what we do is we turn that person into an object. That person becomes a thing, a utility, something to be used, and when it is of no longer any use, we simply discard it, or we pass it along, we give it to someone else, and we get a substitute. And that's how the cycle is, of use and discard, use and discard. In other words, we simply throw it away, as we do perhaps a coffee cup in either styrofoam or paper. When it's done, hopefully, we throw it in the bin. It's trash. Human beings are not coffee cups. They're not a used screwdriver or some other kind of utility. Every human being is made in the image and likeness of God. Every human being is sacred. Every human life is filled with dignity and deserves respect, not simply for one aspect of what that person is, but for the totality of what that person is, made in the image and likeness of God. We don't like to be objectified. We're not a thing. We are a living, thinking, feeling, spiritual, and physical being, unique. There is no one like us. Each and every individual brings a unique presence, a unique gift to the world. And we are not mass-produced. We are not reproduced. Human beings are procreated. The nuptial love of husband and wife, with the presence of Almighty God, infusing an eternal soul in each and every person. What pornography does is it turns the person into an object. It turns the person who engages in it on the buying end into nothing more than a consumer. You're a consumer. The relationship is often simply financial. It's what pleasure you give me. It's what feeling and emotion or release you give me. But beyond that, you really have no inherent value, no intrinsic value. And that's what pornography is. Whenever we take one aspect of a person to the exclusion of all other dimensions and gifts and complexity of that person, and we hold up only one, that is pornography. That is pornographic. That is violence that turns the person into an object. Now, it's easy to see how pornography becomes more and more prevalent and influential in our society. It's so readily available, and we should always, always, always follow the dollar. Follow the money, because pornography is big business. But the other side of the dollar is this. Pornography costs a tremendous amount in terms of dollars and cents. I'll give you some of the latest figures, if I may, and I ask you to bear with me just a moment because I wanted to write them down to make sure that I got these staggering figures to give you some idea of the cost in terms of dollars and cents, because for some people, that's all that matters, dollars and cents. The financial cost of porn to business was $16.9 billion annually. 16.9 it cost businesses in lost productivity, in lost time for employees, and so on. The United States alone is $4.8 billion lost in terms of productivity, income, and lost time in which a person is taken away from their job. However, this again is merely dollars and cents. There is a tremendous cost, as this report says. The human cost is far greater for the younger, and especially for children, because studies are showing us now that children are using the internet at a younger and younger age, and they're visiting more and more porn sites. So what we're doing is we are scarring children at a younger and younger age. We have to understand that sexual pornography is based upon intense feelings. But feelings, like anything else, you reach a level of saturation in which you have to have more intense feelings. You have to have more feelings. You have to have different and more erotic and stranger kinds. Therefore, it's a cycle. As soon as this reaches its level of saturation, like water and a sponge, you have to get a new sponge. Well, you have to get something new to give you that same kind of fix, if you want to use those kind of terms. But I think they're appropriate. They're appropriate. Your brain actually puts off its endorphins and all of these other kind of things that give you that kind of high that takes place. But at a certain point, the brain says, no, I need something more. I need something new, something more erotic and exciting. And so children from a very early age now are learning and are being schooled in the importance of pornography. What they're often missing is the terrible destruction that it does to these young lives. The other statistic is over 37 million employees use work computers to search for porn. This is something that is just amazing. The employer, while the employee is supposed to be sitting there working, is spending a tremendous amount of time searching porn sites. That's a cost. So if you're worried about the dollar and you want to follow the dollar, understand that the internet and the computer are also one of your greatest costs, although it may not show up on your balance sheet. It'll show up on your bottom line, if that's your world. In addition to that, those who frequent the internet for the use of sexual pornography, the odds of teens becoming pregnant are so much higher, teen pregnancy. And one of the causal factors involved is the use of pornography, especially during the teenage years, because it's glamorized, it's sensationalized. Oh, it's so inviting and attractive. It's also quite destructive. If you really want to hinder a young person's life chances, have them 15 or 16 years old, unmarried and with a child. That is a very big, large step towards a life of poverty, not only for them, but also for the child who never asked to be born into those particular circumstances. In addition, it hinders sexual maturity. In other words, if you don't want to serve wine before it's time, you don't want children maturing before they are psychologically and spiritually and intellectually ready. And yet that's just what pornography does. It reaches maturity out of step with actually where that person is in the core of their personhood and in their being. And this causes tremendous problems later in relationships, later in marriage, later in parenting. These are severe handicaps. An issue, finally, on the cost side that I'd like to just mention to you, if I may, is this increase in sex trafficking. The buying and selling of people as sex objects is big business worldwide, in the billions, if not in the trillions of dollars. It's an international business, sex trafficking. But mainly it is young girls who are being exploited and exported in order to fulfill the need and also to fill the pockets of those who engage in such illegal activities. But the profits are so great, which also indicates if the profits are so great, so is the demand. You don't have a profit. That's why you don't have an Edsel automobile anymore. People don't buy them. And so you don't have an Edsel automobile, or you don't have a Pinto, or a few other kinds of automobiles, or any other kind of product. If the demand is not there, you don't have the profit. You don't have the supply. Well, what are the benefits? Well, the benefits can be understood purely and simply in terms of greenbacks. That's what it is. Try this if you would, please. The net worth of the porn industry is $97 billion per year. $97 billion per year. That is, you could feed 4.8 billion people every day for that amount of money. Of the $97 billion per year that's spent on porn, conservatively speaking, 12 billion originates in the United States. $12 billion. It's a staggering number. So the financial element is there. A tremendous amount of money. And these, of course, are conservative figures. Most people don't put that on their income tax return. Hi, I made $3 billion on porn. It probably doesn't show up. They probably talk about it in terms of entertainment or exports, imports. The only trouble is they happen to be doing it with people. A little detail, I suppose. The IRS might not like that, but what the heck. A dollar is a dollar, as we say. The availability of porn is truly breathtaking. Our modern world of technology, our cell phones, our computers, we carry with us wherever we go the opportunity to engage in pornography. Some of the most visited sites, as the expression goes, are porn sites. They're some of the most visited sites, in the millions. One particular site, in a 6-month period, 3.5 million visits. That's an amazing thing, that number of people would click on to that. And when you browse through this thing, or whatever the word is, for these sites, there's all kind of things. How to make a sex video, how to get more viewers to your video, how to be a teenage porn queen, and some of the other things that just shock the consciousness and ought to shock the conscience of us as a people, as a human being, and certainly as a society. But that's exactly what we have there. So it's looked upon through technology. It's right there, easily available, and it's being used. It's heavily used, and it's amazing to me the number of these videos that are advertised up there and the things in which they advertise. We like the regulatory state, and we love our freedom, we love our privacy, we love our autonomy. But who is really monitoring these things? Well, they're free. They're free. My daddy used to tell me, boy, I can't afford free, it's too expensive. This just might be something free that's too expensive, especially for our young people. We've also found out in terms of computers and cell phones and all of the other things, that there exists what we might call a porn gap. A porn gap. That is, the difference between men and women in terms of using porn sites. This is a very interesting study done by Jason Carroll and Brian Willoughby. They had 21,555 participants in their study. And they divided the study up using the participants who are all heterosexual in terms of casual dating, serious dating, engagement, and marriage. And they listed them in terms of the use of pornography by men and women. And what they found was this. In the casual dating relationship, 57% of men visit porn sites, 25% of women. In the serious dating arrangement, 60% of men visit porn sites, again, 25% of women. But an interesting thing happens now. Listen to this carefully, if you would, please. When a couple reaches the stage of engagement, 61% of women engage in pornography through the internet, 38% of men. When marriage is involved, 65% of married women engage in pornography at least once a week. 37% of married men. It's a flip-flop. Men are more likely to look at pornography alone. They're more likely to hide it, especially from their spouse or from the person whom they are getting serious about, maybe even engaged to. And therefore, they like to do it alone. Men alone are loners when it comes to looking at pornography. A lot of it has to do with shame and embarrassment, but also they want to avoid conflict. Because the initial reaction of most women to pornography is, I don't like it. I don't like it. Women, this is interesting, 70 to 80% of women will look at pornography with a partner and practically never look at it alone. They never look at it alone. There is this connection with the other person. Maybe it's wanting to please, wanting to bond, wanting to avoid argument and conflict and all of this kind of stuff, and maybe it's something we do together, that really deserves further investigation. Why this tremendous flip that takes place? We have to be clear about this. Porn is a significant source of conflict within a relationship, especially when the person is married or engaged. 1/3 of all women who are engaged or married believe that their husband or their future husband is engaging in infidelity. They see pornography as infidelity. And this causes a great deal of conflict within the relationship. The idea of virtual sex, the idea of sexting, or whatever the term is, those kinds of things. Men see it in an entirely different frame of reference than do women. Women see pornography as a serious breach of trust a serious exclusion of them from the marriage covenant. Also, one cannot help but wonder, and this is a difficult question, but it's an important one, I think. When husband and wife are engaged in nuptial love, in marital love, the woman often wonders, is my husband making love to me or showing love to me as a spouse? Or is he making love to the latest image he's seen on his sex video? And that doubt is there. And that causes questions of trust, questions of real love. It also causes, for many people, questions of self-worth. Am I really fulfilling his needs? And so I think that these things are very, very important. They're very readily available, driven by the dollar. And there's one other factor I would like to bring to your attention, if I may, before we end this part one of this video on porn pollutes. It is the entrance of alcohol into the use of pornography. I'd like to recommend to you and to share with you a few words from a young lady who wrote the following in a very, very, I think, important and crucial book at this time. It's called Resisting Throwaway Culture, and it's by Charles Camosi, university professor at Fordham. And specific to our point about pornography and alcohol, this young person, her name is mentioned here, I won't mention it, and I won't indicate what magazine she was writing in. She writes the following, which I think are very important, so bear with me just a moment. What my sex life would even look like if alcohol hadn't been there. Alcohol gave me comfort in my own body, and it allowed me to turn my erotic curiosity and hunger for experience into a plan of action. I was tired of being the stuttering girl, sucking in her stomach after the lights went out. I wanted to be the woman who roamed wild and free. Alcohol also helped me cut the girlish strings on my heart, an action my college years demanded. 3 months into my freshman year, I split a six-pack with a dashing sophomore, and we wound up partially clothed on his bed, my bare legs wrapped around his waist, my hands around his neck. I pulled back slightly and asked him the question, the naive question of a girl who does not understand her fate. What does this mean? He looked past me into his studio apartment and then back into my eyes. It means that I'm a 19-year-old boy and we're having fun. For him, the encounter was entertainment. It was recreation. It was a diversion. We can only imagine how that young lady felt after those chilling words. Alcohol, money, and our internet technology, they are being used. In and of themselves, is money a necessary thing? Yes, of course. Go to the store and try to get something without it. Alcohol used responsibly can be an enjoyable additive to an occasion or to an event. Our technology, responsibly used, opens up wide possibilities and vistas to us. See, it ultimately comes back to us. It ultimately comes back to the individual. We can have an EPA for controlling the pollutants to our culture and to our society. We can do all of that. We can ultimately have some kind of virtue police going around controlling what we see, what we read, and how we act. But I don't think any of us really want to live in that kind of society or that kind of world. We're not meant for that. We ultimately must take the responsibility upon ourselves. As Martin Luther, the religious reformer, said, "Here I stand and I can do no other." We must stand in this culture that is being polluted by pornography. And we must take our stand, for as human beings, we can do no other. In part 2 of our discussion of pornography as pollution, we're going to look at some practical approaches to dealing as individuals and as a family and as a group with the issue of pornography. Because you see, at the end of the day, and I'll close with this, at the end of the day, we cannot protect one another from that. Protection is not possible. What we can do is we can prepare. We can prepare our children with a life of virtue. We can protect our children with our example. We can protect our children with our guidance. And we can protect ourselves by living a virtuous life, by living a good life, a moral life, a life that clearly indicates we're not objects, we're persons. And we're persons made in the image and likeness of God. For it is so important to know who we are and whose we are. Hello, and my name is Father William Maestri, and this is Overfed and Undernourished, part 2 of our discussion on pornography. In our first video, we were really interested in the description, that is, kind of giving an overview of the pervasiveness of pornography in our society and culture today. And in fact, pornography is really a worldwide phenomenon. In this particular video, part 2, we want to be a little more prescriptive. We want to talk about some ways in which the individual, as well as the family, and especially the young, might learn to cope, hopefully avoid, and deal with the presence of pornography in our culture and society, and also the ways in which, again, we can cope and deal with this pervasiveness that's present. To begin with, let's focus on the individual. The first and most important step, it is the most difficult step. The first step is to acknowledge, to claim, and to own that I have a problem. I have a problem in this case with pornography. This is a tremendous step forward, because to acknowledge the problem is not simply to talk about a kind of weakness or defect, but it's also to open up a possibility to overcome our attachment, if you will, to pornography. It's also very liberating. Pornography is one of those kind of secret things. We don't necessarily say, "Hi, my name is, and by the way, I look at a lot of pornography." We usually don't do that. It's something that we hide from our family, our friends. We may even hide it from our children and our spouse. We simply don't tell, but we carry it. We carry it within us. And it's a tremendous burden. The lies that we have to tell, the excuses, the rationalizations we tell ourselves, all of those are a heavy burden for us to carry with wherever we go. And so the acknowledgement is really the first and the most important step. And I think that it's very important, because some people say, "Well, I don't want to appear to be weak." It's not weakness to acknowledge a weakness. It's really a strength. It's a strength to be able to claim and to call the thing by its name. It loses power over us. As long as we don't name it, it has tremendous control over us. And it controls our thoughts, it controls our behavior, it controls our relationships with one another. You can, in fact, maybe at this point feel a bit helpless, but you're not hopeless. There's a world of difference. Helplessness means somehow that you have no resources, you have no strength, you have no abilities to somehow get out of this. But you're not hopeless. Hopeless often leads to despair. It leads to simply throwing your hands up and saying, I give up. I might as well just go through this. But we're not hopeless. There's a tremendous amount of resources and strength that we have within our own selves. And I suppose one of the most important things we can do is to take an inventory. It's not easy, and it's often difficult, but we ought to spend a few moments by ourselves with a paper and pencil and make an inventory. What are your assets? What are your strengths within and without? Your family, your friends. And this is important because we want to take an approach that is both and. Both knowledge that we gain from the human sciences, from the behavioral sciences, as well as the importance that faith can be, that the religious factor can be in our own lives. We tend to kind of shy away from that. We shouldn't. It can be a tremendous aid and grace in our overcoming this particular problem in our own life, as well as affecting the lives of others. So what are the assets that we have? And sometimes we have to sit down and really think about it, because we tend to think of assets in terms of dollars and cents. But I'm talking about the kind of social capital that we have, of those around us who would support us and can support us and give us strength during this particular time in our lives. Our faith is very important. Faith and religion offers us a significant way forward. Say, well, I don't really feel comfortable talking about pornography because I feel guilty, I'm ashamed, I'm embarrassed. All of those things are real. And in an important way, they are strengths. Why do I say that? Because the feelings of guilt and shame and embarrassment are signs that our conscience is working. It's a sign that the moral radar is operating in our own lives, and it's telling us something is wrong. This behavior does not fit the kind of person we are and the kind of person we want to be. So the acknowledgement of that, I think, is very, very important. To say, yes, I feel these things, but I can also see them as a sign of hope, that I want to move beyond this. I want to move past this in my life and also in the lives of others that I may deeply influence. We ought to take an inventory of our triggers. What I mean by that is, what are those situations, what are those people, and what are those emotions within us that trigger this craving or this desire for pornography? It might be loneliness, frustration, anxiety. It might be feelings of rejection, lack of fulfillment. Whatever those particular feelings are that trigger, let me go to the computer or let me go onto the internet and relieve these particular feelings, however short-lived that may be. Our triggers may be people. Are there certain people that we are associated with in which the end game is always to view pornography and talk about it? You can't afford those kind of friends. because in reality, they're not your friends. They're not your friends. They are keeping you mired in a situation that is only destructive for you and for those around you. There are certain people that you must avoid. Well, that doesn't sound Christian. No, it's very Christian, because maybe then they too will come to the realization that maybe I should look into this and see what I'm doing. Why are the dynamics always ending in the viewing of pornography? So there's certain people that we ought to avoid. And then there's also the emotions that seem to come out of the blue. I just have this craving. I have this desire to go view some pornography. What are those feelings, and what can we do? How can we respond to those? What are our usual responses when we feel the urge? Is it simply to go and indulge? Is it almost a kind of impulse behavior to quiet the desire? Perhaps we take a walk around the block. Maybe we go do some exercise. We ride a bike. Maybe we even read a religious book, or we say some prayers. We do something to divert our attention and to try to divert these feelings. Well, what are the positive and negative techniques that we use in response to the particular cravings? Which ones work? Which ones seem to help us, however short-lived as well? And what are those things that seem not to work at all? And we have to try to build on what works and move past those that really do not. And the next thing, if we actually get to the point where we acknowledge it, the problem, we want help, we want to seek the aid and the help of others, the question naturally arises, well, who? To whom do we go? To whom do we go? First and foremost, I think you should go to someone who shares your values. If it's religious values, that's very important. Get someone who shares your religious values. Maybe someone who shares the same faith that you have. That's very, very important, right up front. Secondly, you want to make sure that the person is competent, that the person is qualified to be able to give sound, good advice and direction in dealing with this particular problem. And thirdly, you want to make sure that the person really honors you as a person. I think it's true that without reverence, there is no revelation. If you get the feeling that the person really doesn't honor you or reverence you as a person, or is going to immediately come to judgment or to fix you or to somehow get you where you need to be, often what happens is we withdraw. I remember as teaching, the first day of class, I would always try to ask a question that a student could answer. And even if the student didn't answer the question properly, I tried to somehow massage the answer so that I could say something good about the response and something good about the student. If I immediately said, no, that's wrong, how could you even raise your hand and give such a response? The likelihood of my ever getting other students to venture forth an answer was going to be nil. It's not going to happen. So find somebody who really reverences you so that you can honestly and forthrightly reveal what's going on inside of your own life, your own thinking, your own experience. I think that that's very, very important. And once you find that person, and it may be the reference from a friend, a referral, it may be somebody you've seen at a distance, maybe in church, maybe in various other gatherings, and they are known as a very competent and understanding kind of person. They may be in the field. They may be in the field of human behavior. And you've observed that person, and they look trustworthy, and they look competent and honest. And that's important as well. You want somebody who tells you the hard truth and not the easy lie. You want somebody who's going to hold up a mirror and is going to let you see you for who you are, but also to hold out for you that distant mirror for whom you want to be. Both of those things are very, very important in selecting the person that you want to be your director or your guide in this particular journey that you've taken. And the journey that you've taken is not an easy one. It's hard. It's demanding. It requires a dirty 4-letter word, and the word is work. It requires work, it requires effort, it requires a personal investment. And once you make that step, what you're doing is you're deciding to live outside the shadows. You're coming out of the shadows. To at least one person, you are willing to, if you want, bare your soul or bare what is really troubling you and what is holding you back from being the kind of person that you want to be. This is difficult. I often think of the life of St. Paul, the apostle. Before he was St. Paul, he was Saul, and he was a real zealot. He was a Hebrew of Hebrew stock, and he went around persecuting the Christians. In fact, he was there supervising the martyrdom of the first Christian saint, St. Stephen. He was supervising the whole thing, and they stoned Stephen. And in fact, Paul had gathered up a number of other followers of Christ, other disciples, and he was taking them to Damascus. And on the road there, he met the Lord Jesus Christ. And the light was so bright that he was blinded for 3 days. He was blinded before he could see. And he's then introduced to those whom he once persecuted, and their first reaction was, let's get away from this guy. This is not going to work. I mean, this is the guy who killed Stephen, and we know what he's going to do to us. It took time. Re-entry is always difficult because people's last memory of us may be something less than pleasant, less than the kind of memory we would like to leave with them. And so I think it's very important that after we move through a decent period of individual direction, that perhaps it's offered that we look for group support. That group support can be in a non-religious setting, as many groups are, but it could also be in a church setting, perhaps in your parish or your church or your faith community. There are individuals there who meet regularly to discuss their difficulties, their challenges, but also their victories, their step forward. This tells you you are not alone. You're not by yourself. That we can often feel very alone in our problems, very alone in our difficulties. That I'm the only one, or if people only knew. I wonder if anybody else is like this. This gives us that kind of support, especially within a faith group, that our faith becomes something very, very important and very powerful in walking to recovery, in walking past where we are to where we want to be. And I think it's important that we try to avoid the near occasions. We avoid the near occasions of those things that once again trigger our behavior, that inflame our desires. This means we have to practice a certain discipline that allows us where we can go, with whom we can go, what activities we engage in. That's a kind of quarantine that's very important for the health of our soul. We have to really pick our friends carefully, our associates carefully. That's very, very important. And perhaps as we move through this journey and through this process, we arrive at a point where we're able to make an act of contrition. That is, those whom we may have affected adversely, those whom we have hurt, those relationships that are broken. We might be able to mend bridges and reopen gates. we're able to say, I'm sorry for what I did. I know it was my responsibility, and I want to make amends. That is not weakness. That is one of the supreme acts of courage. The ability to go back, not simply to acknowledge to myself, not even to acknowledge to God, as if God doesn't know it already, but to go to those individuals, many of whom are very important to us, who stood by us and loved us and cared for us. And pornography became more important than those relationships and those people. But in asking forgiveness, I think it's very important because, people are very forgiving. People are forgiving. Who hasn't stumbled? Who hasn't fallen? Who would like their closet open so we can see all the things that are in the closet? I wouldn't. Not sure most of the people that I know, if not all of them, wouldn't want that. But we forgive and we understand. And we want to move on, especially when we say, I know I did something wrong, I acknowledge it, and I want to ask your forgiveness. Most people do not walk away. I know one thing, God doesn't walk away. God doesn't walk away. God didn't send his son, Jesus Christ, to take upon himself the sins of the world, guilt, punishment. Take it to Calvary on the cross. Jesus said, I have come to save the lost. I am here for those. If we really accept that people are forgiving, that they understand, and in fact they want to help, they want to be an aid, and if we believe that God forgives, God knows all and forgives all, God accepts us as we are, but God says, you don't have to stay as you are. You can become what I've always wanted you to be. Then the third component, and the very important one, is, can I accept my forgiveness? Can I live with forgiveness? So many people believe that they've lived a life, or they've committed sins, or they've done wrongs, for which there is no forgiveness. It's the reenactment of the story of Cain and Abel. My sin is too great to be forgiven. And what happens to Cain? He becomes a wanderer on the face of the earth. When we do not believe in the forgiveness of others, above all God's forgiveness, and the ability to accept that forgiveness, we really become wanderers on the face of the earth. We're always moving. We're roaming. We don't have roots. We don't have that stability, if you want that serenity of our mind and our hearts and of our soul. But the forgiveness is offered. We have to accept our acceptance, accept forgiveness. And that's no easy task, I grant you, but it's a very necessary one, very necessary one. And so, these are some preliminary considerations, I think, for the individual in addressing the problem of pornography. And you may say, but I'm so lost and I feel so dead. There's really no way back for me. I would refer to the great parable by Jesus of the prodigal son, or in this case, prodigal son and daughter. The prodigal takes off, lives a loose life, and then comes to his senses, as St. Luke says. In other words, he becomes open to grace. He becomes open to the possibility of a homecoming. And so the father, standing on the porch, sees the son at a distance, coming toward him. He rushes down and embraces him. Doesn't listen to his apology, his explanation, his excuses. He doesn't listen to any of that sort of stuff. He says, get the robe, get the sandals, get the ring, kill the fatted calf. We have to celebrate. The only one who is really the prodigal is the son who stayed home and is resentful. He's the one who can't go in and celebrate. But the father says, we have to celebrate. Well, why are we celebrating the son who spent all your money, lived a loose life? And the father says, we have to celebrate, son, because the lost has been found and the dead have come back to life. That parable is very powerful and speaks to each and every one of us. In some degree, we're lost, but we can be found. We've died inside, but we can come back to life. Accept forgiveness and accept the challenge. Do not let your problems be your future, but your future is the possibilities that you accept, embrace, and walk toward. The final part of this second tape, I would like to address just a brief word, if I may, to the engaged, those who are married, and especially to families that have young children, teenagers, or maybe even preteens. To the engaged, many places require a kind of pre-cana or a kind of prenuptial, a series of interviews or discussions between the couple and the minister, the priest, the rabbi, who is going to perform the ceremony for the particular couple. And there's a whole bunch of inventory questions that are asked. And the questions usually in that particular section revolve around drugs, alcohol, gambling, things like that. I found that many times the question of pornography doesn't even come up. It's kind of avoided. This is unfortunate because the question of pornography, which is very pervasive and is often hidden and may be unknown to the couple that are engaged and are right at marriage's doorstep, that needs to be discussed before those commitments are made to marriage. They need to be worked through. This is not a light issue. Uncomfortable, yes. Demanding, absolutely. And they should be, because your future together will depend to a great extent on the ability to which you can be honest and face these kinds of issues. So if by chance the priest or the rabbi or the minister performing your ceremony doesn't bring it up to one another, and if the occasion arises, bring it up as an issue in front of the minister, the priest or the rabbi. I think that that's a very, very important issue that needs to be worked on and worked through by the couple themselves. The married people who are married. And this may come up. It never came up in the courtship. It never came up in the engagement period. And now we find out that it's a problem now that they're married. This is a difficult situation. But honest communication, and I know that word is overused, I understand that, but honest communication is essential. The ability to honestly speak to one another about their weaknesses and their failures, but also their strengths. The willingness to work through this together. After all, the couple is in that covenant of love. And love is strong enough, powerful enough that two can walk through it. But it has to be walked through together. Again, recovery is not a solo activity. It's not for the rugged individual. It demands that kind of support. Anger, resentment, the silent treatment, the guilt trip, the shaming, all of that is very counterproductive. It's not constructive, it's destructive. But to honestly confront the other and honestly listen to the story of the other, not simply hear it, but listen with our heart and with our soul and with our mind and understanding. But we also have to engage ourselves completely in what the other has to say. And Very often it may require outside help through one's priest, minister, or rabbi. It may also require professional help. Again, help is not a bad word. The really bad word is denial. That's the bad word, because that gets us nowhere. Because you can't solve a problem for which there is no problem, supposedly. I don't think that's an act of futility if ever there was one. And finally, about teens, especially preteens and during those early and middle adolescent years. We know from statistics and studies that pornography is being viewed by young people at an earlier and earlier age. And this may very well happen by accident. We all have cell phones and computers and all of this sort of stuff. And by accident it may happen. You hit one of these sites and something pops up that you never even imagined, and the child sees it. What did they do? Who did they tell? Did they do something bad? How do you tell mother and father what you saw? My goodness. So you keep it a secret. And then you may tell a friend or two, and then the friend or two, of course, tells 10 other friends, and pretty soon. But you see what happens. It's so important for parents. For parents are crucial in those early encounters and early years of communication. And the best communication a parent can give is the communication of example. And having opportunities for families to gather together. You don't have to sit down and have the big long talk about the birds and the bees. You don't have to have some kind of formal lecture. But often, for example, in the course of having supper, to find out what's going on in the world of the child. It may very well come up. And it's not about being shocked or condemning. How could she do such a thing? Because the child may very well invent a phantom person. Somebody at school today said, somebody at school saw this, and that's to gauge your reaction. And so if your reaction is one of horror and condemnation and disgust, I would imagine that child will never bring it up. And that child will go in all the wrong places for all the wrong answers. Because you've sent a clear signal. This is off limits. Do not trespass, do not bring it up. Because if you do, you will get the wrath of the parents, not to mention the wrath of God as well, perhaps, if they manage to wiggle God into that, which I don't think God wants any part of, but nonetheless. But what can parents do? I think the most important thing that a parent can do is to set boundaries, reasonable boundaries. Setting of boundaries is important to discipline and love, and discipline and love go together. Many people believe today that if you really love somebody, you just let them run wild, let them be free, born free, and all of that sort of stuff. That's not freedom, that's neglect. It can often become abuse. To raise a child without any boundaries, that's chaos. The child grows up with a chaotic interior because the outside is chaotic. Yeah, do whatever you want. I trust my children. They're so mature. They're so free. How old are they? 12. Oh my goodness. No, that child needs to know that there's somebody there setting boundaries, not because they're mean, but because they love them and they care for them. Time management, the boundary of time management. How much time does a child spend on the computer or on the phone? That should be limited. There are other things much more important than fooling with games on the computer or on the phone, or talking on the phone, or texting on the phone, and all of these other activities. Limit the time with devices, the kind of devices that they have, what's on the devices. Doesn't that violate their privacy? No, it doesn't violate their privacy. It opens the door to parental concern, and for good reason. Who are their friends? Who are the people that they associate with? Are they, we used to say, wise beyond their years? In many instances, they're foolish beyond their years and dangerous. Many children know too many things that they're really not prepared to process. They don't have the maturity level, they don't have the experience, the understanding that will come with age, and often with mistakes. If we're wise, we learn through our mistakes. And this is a difficult one, the idea of setting curfew. Oh, just come home whenever you finished. No. See, it's all part of boundaries and discipline in helping a person mature. Because you really can't go through life without boundaries, without discipline. You can't hold a job. You'll never be successful without those. And again, it's not a punishment of meanness. It's a discipline and forming a structure, a character, if you will, to help that person navigate through life. It's difficult to be a parent today. It's very difficult because there's so many influences that bombard children, that enter the home, that enter marriage, that come to the individual, married or not, from the outside. Pornography happens to be a very powerful influence, as we talked about in our first video, and its pervasiveness today. But again, it need not conquer us. We have many resources. We have many resources. And we ought not to wave the white flag of surrender. We ought to really join together in our resources, our faith, our capital resources, our social resources of individuals and families and groups that form communities that really want to raise good and virtuous children. Living in today's world is anything but boring. Living in today's world is a challenge, because living today is really the great adventure. The question is, are we willing to take the ride?